Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Nadia Ali. I'm the director of Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown University. And it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to today's event, which will be a conversation with Isabel Käser, Cynthia Enloe, and Handan Shailayan to discuss Isabel Käser's recently published book, The Kurdish Women's Freedom Movement, Gender Body Politics, and Militant Femininities. Let me introduce our speakers to you today. Isabel Käser is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bern and a visiting fellow at the LSE Middle East Center. She gained her PhD at SOAS and has previously worked in journalism and diplomacy, most recently leading the research project Art and Peace Meditation for the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. She has lectured at the University of Bern and the University of Kurdistan Hawla and is currently the principal investigator of a collaborative project between the LSE and the UKH titled The Kurdistan Region of Iraq Post-ISIS, Youth, Art and Gender. Cynthia Enloe is a research professor in the Department of International Development, Community and Environment, with affiliations with Women's and Gender Studies and Political Science at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. Among her many books, last time I knew it was 15. I don't know if so I'm not going to mention all of them. I assume many of you have read many of her books, but I'm just mentioning The Big Push, Exposing and Challenging Persistent Patriarchy, the updated edition of Bananas, Beaches and Bases, as well as Nemo's War, Emma's War, Making Feminist Sense of the Iraq War. Welcome, Cynthia. And our third guest is Handan Shailayan, who is the author of the book Women in the Kurdish Movement, Mothers, Comrades, Goddesses. She's currently a guest researcher at Humboldt University and has been working with immigrant Arab, Kurdish, and Turkish women. She previously was guest researcher at the Otto-Friedrich University in Bamberg, and she has been teaching at a Turkey-based online human rights school since 2018 and at the Human Rights Department at the University of Ankara. Her areas of expertise and academic interest are gender, nationalism, women's labor, migration, and social linguistics. Welcome, all of you. I'm really excited to be in a conversation with you. So the idea is that we'll be talking for about an hour, but I encourage the audience to put in your comments and questions in the Q&A function. And, we will be putting aside at least half an hour for Q&A. But if, many questions come in, I'll get to them earlier. So I would like to start out, Isabel, by asking you, why did you write the book and what is the book about?
Thank you so much, Nadia. Before I start talking about my book, I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you. Thank you to the wonderful women in this virtual room, to Barbara for organizing the event, to you, Nadia, for chairing it, to Handan and Cynthia for taking the time to read my work and discuss it here with me today. Everyone who reads my book will see how much of it is based on the work by you, Nadia, Handan, and Cynthia, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. So about the book is obviously about the Kurdish women's movement. So the women's branch of the Kurdish Freedom Movement, better known as the PKK. And I wrote it because I wanted to understand how women got to play such central roles in that movement. And I decided that I wanted to do this research when the Rojava Revolution started to gain momentum around 2013. And we started seeing women demarcating the new boundaries between the new Kurdish cantons in Syria's northeast as fighters, as protesters, activists, and mothers. And I wanted to understand what brought them there. And so when I started this research, ISIS or Daesh was not yet in the picture, visibly to me at least, and certainly not as a key player in the region. So I thought I could spend a lot of time in what later became Rojava and conduct most of my research there. Then Daesh attacked Kobani and Shengal, in 2014, and it became clear that it would not be possible. And so I did most of my fieldwork in Eastern Turkey, which the movement refers to as Bakur, and Northern Iraq, also called Bashur, and only a very short amount of time in Rojava. In the end, this actually helped me to gain a sense of how this movement operates transnationally, how knowledge and practices travel across borders, and how women in that movement also move between the mountains and the cities. So the book is very much shaped by my trajectory as a researcher, the spaces I had access to, and the borders that I could eventually no longer cross. And so the book begins with a history of the Kurdish women's movement, and then takes the reader through the spaces that I did spend a lot of time in with the women of the movement. So in Diyarbakir and the women's structures there, the mountain guerrilla camps where the women learned to become militants, the martyr mothers in Mahmur, and the ritualization of death there. And lastly, I unpack the movement's body politics by looking at the different what I call party bargains that women enter once they join. So in short, the book is a transnational analysis of a movement that centers gender equality in its liberation ideology. And I look at how this ideology and the women's structures developed historically, and how women today implement this ideology in the political, activist, and armed spheres in a context of ongoing wars and insecurities.
Mm-hmm. Isabel, I'm going to ask you about literature in a moment, but just several people commented prior to the event, you know, when we showed the poster, they commented about the book cover. Can you say a little bit, yes, thank you, Cynthia. So can you say a little bit about that? Who's the artist? Why did you choose the cover? It's beautiful.
Thank you so much. Yes, I did put a lot of love and labor also into the cover. It was really important for me that it would not be another book with a woman with a Kalashnikov smiling on a mountain or on some kind of front line, which we've seen a lot since that surge in the literature since 2014. And I wanted to do something different. I looked for that image for a long time, and eventually I found it. So this is a painting called The Face of Crystal. The artist is called Lukman Ahmed. He's an artist from northern Syria, from Rojava, who's based in the US, and who kindly gave me the permission to use this image for my book. And what I think makes it so powerful is that it shows this ambivalence in Crystal's face. On the one hand, she's extremely determined and obviously strong, but she's also angry and hurt. To me, at least, that's how I interpret it. And then there's this banner or bunting that comes out of her head, or is somewhat behind her, and I also interpret that as her, you know, sort of the legacy of the other women who came before her that enabled her to stand there. So that's what I see in it, but I'm sure other people interpret it differently.
Yeah, that's the beauty of art, but I think it's striking. It's a really lovely cover. So I mean, I don't want to kind of get into too in-depth academic discussions in terms of theoretical literature, but I think it is important for you to reflect a little bit on the way your book actually fits in and contributes to the existing literature. And I mean, that's particularly important because, of course, we have Handan and Cynthia here today, and I'm going to turn to them in a moment. But can you reflect a little bit on that?
Yes. I was always thinking, when my book comes out, where would I want it to be placed in a library? So I think, so in my dream library, I would need two copies, one standing next to the gender and war books that look critically at women in war, nationalism, feminism, and militarism, and the other one, of course, on the shelf with the Kurdish studies books. Aside from that, let me situate it perhaps a bit more. As we all know, existing post-colonial and transnational feminist literature on gender and war teaches us that women are often pushed back into the private sphere post-conflict, and that the more militarized the society is, the more gender-based violence occurs. That violence moves on a continuum and does not end when a peace treaty is signed. the Kurdish women's movement knows this, and almost everyone I interviewed emphasized that they try to avoid exactly that by creating parallel women's structures in all spheres of activism. So the co-presidency or the women's quota would be kind of hard fought for result of this. So they claim that because of those efforts, women cannot be pushed back, both during and post-conflict. I took this claim and its practices and put it into conversation with existing feminist international relations theory that asks, where are the women and how did they get here? And now there's a growing body of literature that looks at violent women or women engaged in armed struggle, but most of them focus on why women join. Why do they commit acts of violence? Or they focus on the representation thereof. And I found it just as relevant to ask, what keeps the women there? What creates the meaning that enables women to persevere and continue and to become militants in this extremely costly struggle, where life is incredibly hard and death is always a possibility. So I looked at the education and training of the guerrillas in one chapter, and that process of becoming and obtaining and embodying what I call militant femininity. Within Kurdish studies, I found women to be severely underrepresented until a few years ago. While we had a number of studies on the PKK as a whole, the gender aspect and how that had shifted over time often only merited perhaps a sub-chapter. This has, of course, changed, as we all know, with the Rojava Revolution since 2014. We've seen a surge in publications about the Kurdish women's movement, many of them written by activists, journalists, and academics, I would say closer to the movement, who tell what I found to be an important but often simplified story of the women's freedom fighters and the Rojava project. While at the same time, Western media was reproducing Orientalist stereotypes of that one exceptional militia fighting in an otherwise barbaric Middle East. So as I set out, I found things to be a bit more complicated, and that both accounts brush over much more complex histories of violence and resistance. And so I placed this book, yes, within feminist IR, but also critical military studies, both of which take seriously women's own motivations and histories to join movements like the PKK. And based on this, my work then pays attention to, or I try to pay attention to, the true cost of war and look carefully at how these new femininities and masculinities are created that then sustain this movement, including not shying away from asking some of the more uncomfortable questions as well about how the new body politics that I believe are central to how this movement operates.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Cynthia, if I can turn to you now, because of course your work has been so key to Isabel's conceptual framework and methodology, as it has been to so many of us. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those key concepts, such as women's engagement in national liberation wars, militarism, and body politics, and how do you think Isabel's book is contributing to feminist IR literature?
First of all, congratulations, Isabel. I mean, really having a book in hand, that's a big deal, you know? That doesn't just come out of the ether. So this is, I would urge everybody to get it for their library, to read it. I have really learned so much by working with Isabel, and rereading the book now a couple of times reminds me how much you've contributed. And I think one of the reasons why your book is so valuable, and I would say so necessary to any of us who are interested in the questions of patriarchy and militarization, gender and violence, movement politics and armed struggle, all those three things, which are always unstable, always in process, is that you are so conscious of the intellectual history of this dilemma, and they are dilemmas. I mean, I think the first time I really tried to think about this was when some of the Algerian women were breaking away from the ruling party in post-revolution Algeria against the French. But then I've heard it so often. And one of the things that is striking is how not just we as, scribblers and teachers, but rather how women themselves in very specific times and places try to learn the lessons from each other. So you've probably all heard this as well, but South African women under apartheid, when they were creating an armed insurrection against the apartheid white supremacist regime, and as it was ending the armed struggle part, they were tutored, literally tutored by Zimbabwean women who said, careful, careful, careful. You're right at a point now where peace is being teased out of armed struggle. Look out, said the Zimbabwean women. We've gone through that. We didn't pay attention. Look out, this is dangerous time for women's achievements and women's pursuit of liberation goals. The Palestinian women, as Nadia has taught us, that Palestinian women listened to and were tutored by Algerian women who said, look out, look out, look out. The men who run the anti-colonial insurrection may need you during the fighting, but in their heads, they have dreams of the patriarchal family, and they will try to reinstitute that. Say the Algerian women to the Palestinian women. The Cuban women gave the same caveats to the Nicaraguan women. Now, in most of these cases, the caveats didn't really take root. You have to take root. You have to have power and structure and influence and be, as they say, at the table. What I love about your book, Isabel, is that you are standing on the shoulders of these caveats. You are standing on the shoulders of these efforts, inching forward, sometimes being thrown back, the Algerian insurrectionist women would say, in other places, and that your book isn't just the newest book, it is, and the newest study and the newest interrogation. It is really close listening, as you said, to Kurdish fighting women who know they are standing on the shoulders of failures and successes and caveats and lessons. That makes your book really exceptional. That is, it means that your early chapters, what other people would call the lit review, it is not a lit review. To my mind, it is so much more valuable than that, because it really is lessons learned, lessons buried, lessons re-unearthed, lessons that are hard to actually put into practice. So your book is, again, yes, it is the latest, and it will be the lessons for the next. I'm thinking about Ukrainian women right now who don't think they're joining a women's movement. They think they're joining a resistance to armed aggression movement. Yeah. I'm going to turn off mine and let's go on to Handan, and then I'll come back.
Okay. And then, I also, of course, myself, Isabel, and so many of us have learned so much from your amazing, groundbreaking work on the Kurdish women's movement. And I know that Isabel has used a lot of what you've written, as I've done as well. And so I'm very curious to know, how do you read Isabel's work, especially in light of her building on your insights about the significance of gender in Kurdish nationalism?
Yeah, thank you, Nadia, for your kind words. And hello, everyone. Please let me at first express my pleasure to be here with you all. I have learned a lot from Cynthia, of course, as many feminist scholars, and also I learned from your works too, dear Nadia. And it is really amazing to be here to talk about a fantastic book by Isabel. I'm really very glad. So how did I read this book? Actually, I wouldn't call it just a reading because I felt like I was accompanying Isabel in her field work. Reading the book, took me to the field which I have a strong personal and emotional bond with. And while reading her analysis of the interviews she conducted or reflecting on encounters she experienced, I actually often found myself in a dialogue with her. And I had many discussions actually with her, which was very stimulating. In fact, I think that dialogue is an appropriate term to also describe the way she conducted her field and she wrote her book also. Her analysis and writings on gender and Kurdish movements were mainly based on, for me, this is my opinion, based on the Kurdish women's narratives and her observations on their practices in the field in daily life. But also it is a kind of dialogue with the literature and with previous research, including mine. And so when I started, for example, to think on Kurdish women's political activism at the end of 1990s, just soon after being released from prison, there were also no sources on Kurdish women's political activism except for few publications like by dear Sherzad Mojab or by Necla Açık. While trying to work around the lack of sources, actually Cynthia's analysis on gender, nationalism, and militarism, and also Deniz Kandiyotti's concept of patriarchal bargaining shed light on the way of understanding and also analyzing Kurdish women's political participation, and also the interrelation between gender and Kurdish women. So both the analytical frame provided by Cynthia and the concept of Deniz Kandiyotti, the patriarchal bargaining, are at the very core of Isabel's book too. With this analytical framework and concept, Isabel deepens her own analysis on gender and the Kurdish movement. Furthermore, Isabel forms a new analytical concept too, militant feminities. This concept actually helps us not only to get a deeper understanding of the Kurdish women's freedom movement, but also I think will be very useful in analyzing women's freedom movements in different contexts also. So what I found particularly impressive about the book is the multi-layered interrelations between the Kurdish women's freedom movement and the Kurdish woman that she provides. And her work is really very comprehensive and analytical. And I believe that Isabel, with her book, has done a very important contribution in the field of gender, social and political movements, and also militarism. The last point I want to stress is that it is a very feminist way of knowledge production, I think, to learn from practice and from each other, and to let the text to be in dialogue with each other, and relying on this dialogue to develop new ideas, concepts, and other analytical tools. I think it is very precious to see women scholars, trans-regional, decolonial knowledge exchange in the mainstream, male-dominated, Western-centered academia, which is sometimes also colonialist and sometimes Orientalist. So I really want to congratulate Isabel one more time for her work and for this amazing book.
Thanks so much, Handan, and I'm very pleased to know that I think Necla Açık, who of course we've all learned from, is joining us. And I should also mention, because obviously I also know Isabel's work quite well, the other important contributor in terms of gender and nationalism is Nera Yuval Davis, who's also joining us in the audience. I'm very pleased. Now, Isabel, I want to turn back to you. And I mean, I was at times, quite worried about you as you were doing your research. I mean, the research for the book was extremely challenging in light of the situation on the ground in terms of conflict, war, violence, and political tensions and sensitivities. So I was wondering if you could share some of your experiences doing the ethnographic research for your book, which was, of course, originally your PhD.
Yeah, actually, when I think about, there are some similarities with the time Isabel did her field research, yes. But also differences. For example, there was also conflict, and there was also very high political tension while Isabel conducted her field work. It was also the same for me, but there are differences too. Just an example. When I was writing my PhD thesis, I had to always to keep my writings. I had to save them in another place because, it was very difficult actually. Yeah. And also still now, for example, many of my friends, they are in prison at the moment just because of their political ideas, or just only they expressed name of Kurdistan or Bashur, or yes. It depends on the political tension, and not easy actually.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing that. And so, Isabel, can you reflect on your experiences, which there, of course, resonates quite a bit with Handan's?
Yes. So there are so many where to start, but I'll talk a bit about access and borders, but also sort of personal feelings of self-doubt and being overwhelmed a lot of times as well. So I started my PhD, as I mentioned, sort of at the height of the war against Daesh. And Daesh was attacking Kobani and Shengal, which led to huge protests and announcements of states of autonomy of certain municipalities in southeastern Turkey. To this, the Turkish state and army responded with siege warfare and what has become known as the urban wars in southeastern Turkey, that started in 2015 and led to the large-scale destruction of many Kurdish cities or parts of cities. As I arrived in the so-called field, in that instance, Diyarbakir, these urban wars had just started, and I think, Nadia, you were there at that time as well. So that meant that parts of the city, in Diyarbakir, the historical center Sur, was being shelled while I was trying to organize interviews. It also meant that the women I was hoping to work with were under targeted and sustained attacks by the government, and of course had many better things to do than talk to me. So despite that, they were extremely gracious and welcoming me at their centers and into their structures. As the war intensified, my access and room for movement became increasingly limited, and I started to feel more and more inadequate and out of place at times, incredibly powerless as well. And these feelings accompanied me throughout fieldwork and beyond, as I later went to Rojava and Iraqi Kurdistan and Mahmud, which was even closer to the border with Daesh. So the injustices, this overbearingness of violence, the living in violence, was something that I only very slowly got used to, but which is of course the reality of many of the people I worked with. Aside from that, certain borders became more and more difficult or impossible to cross. For example, I was eventually deported from Turkey and labeled a threat to national security, which meant that for the second half of my fieldwork, I could only be in Iraqi Kurdistan. Another huge challenge for me was the density and intensity of the movement's cosmology, meaning, among other things, the ideology and the repetition thereof. I write about how difficult I found it to go beyond the slogans of resistance and liberation that were so often narrated back to me wherever I went in the different parts of Kurdistan. I was both amazed and frustrated by the uniformity of what I was told. Eventually, I stopped doing interviews and just did participant observation, and I found that to be much richer and much more telling of the lived realities of my respondents. And in the end, I understood these slogans as part of the revolutionary labor that women do and have to do when speaking to a researcher like me. But of course, it's also much more than that. These slogans are the result of decades of struggle and continue to help women to push for more gender equality and justice. Yeah, I could go on. I'm just maybe going to say one or two more things, but
yes,
another
that's fine. Yes, you can
Could
say.
I continue? Okay. Another thing that I struggled with was to be entirely drawn into the urgency of this struggle, to witness that incredible imbalance and injustice of the attacking Turkish army on the one side and the noble resistors on the other, while also holding on to my criticality. And so I observed myself becoming militarized and radicalized myself as something that I really had to take a few steps back from when I started writing. And then, of course, the field doesn't end. You don't stop caring. The war goes on. Friends have been imprisoned or killed. Others have left the movement and have migrated to Europe, where they struggle to build a new life, all dealing with wounded and traumatized bodies. So I think I'm going to leave it there. There's more, but perhaps we can come back to this in the question and answer.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so Handan, maybe back to you. I mean, it's clear that Isabel has grappled with a number of questions linked to her positionality. I mean, there was, at the time when she was doing the research, as she was describing, there was all this sort of romanticizing of, you know, the Kurdish female fighter against ISIS, but in a very unreflective manner, because there were no discussions about the question or the fact that the PKK was still criminalized. So, you know, this big contradiction. Anyway, so she, as she just said, she's grappling with a number of ethical questions. And I was just wondering, you know, if you can reflect a little bit on that. And particularly, I feel that there is this this tension, you know, on the one hand, recognizing the potential limitations of an outside view, but not falling into the trap of romanticizing or essentializing an insider view and, you know, the authentic insider. So I was wondering, what is your take on that question?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Nadia, because I think one of the important features of the book is that Isabel shares her positionality with her participants in the field and also with readers of the book very frankly. I encountered many times that she was sharing her dilemmas or contradictions related to her positionality and how she tried to manage them. And also she shares her perceptions about the field, about the people she interviewed, and also her perceptions on how she was being perceived actually. And she reflected on this not just during her structured interviews, but also during informal dialogues between her and her participants. For example, with female guerrillas in the darkness of the night, on body, menstruation, womanhood, or with women in the Mahmur refugee camp on marriage, home chores, cleaning habits. They were all very exciting actually to read. I read those parts as an invitation to think together on the themes they discussed and many more questions that they invited to think about. One thing when she was trying to manage those dilemmas, I think she applied to Cynthia's concept of feminist curiosity. And yeah, for positionality, actually, I would like to say something on self-reflexivity here. I would like to read more about exchange between Isabel and her participants. Yeah, her analysis on women she interviewed were very deep, fantastic, and very inspiring. I do not mean academic analysis on the field, but beyond it on interrelation and exchange with her and with the woman she interviewed. Actually, during, for example, I think it took around 1 year to be in the field. During this time, when she was in the field, she encountered and listened many females in Diyarbakir, in Süleymaniye, in Mahmur, in guerrilla camps, and also in diaspora. Actually, I wondered how did those encounters affected her. So I mean, the Isabel at the beginning of the field research and the end of the research was the same person.
That's a really good question, and I'm going to ask Isabel in a moment. But I was wondering, Hadan, how did it come up for you when you did your research? So you're very differently positioned, but I mean, but you still have positionality, and were there any kind of ethical issues you were grappling with? I mean, if you like to share anything.
Yeah, it is as you can, or our participants can guess, it was very difficult actually, because I was also an insider, in many aspects. I was an insider. I was just released from prison, and I was working on the women committees of People's Democratic Party, which was a pro-Kurdish political party, and I was organizing the meetings, women events, and at the same time I was the one who was conducting a research on that she was in it actually. Yes. At the beginning, what I wanted to make was that I was encountered very powerful women in the prison, and I wanted to, and they, at that time, they were not like today, they were very invisible actually. There weren't any academic research about them, and it was very amazing for me, because as a petty bourgeois, middle class Turkish Kurdish academics, for me, it was like that. Political struggle for political consciousness, you have to read, you have to learn by reading. But in prison, what I faced was women, they learned from their experiences. And I just wanted to show it. But when I started to reading on nationalism, gender, feminism, so I faced another side of this issue. So because that's why patriarchal bargaining was very crucial for me, because there was an amazing struggle and very emancipatory ideology, but at the same time, I found that there was also patriarchal control over the woman. So it was very distracting for me, and I stopped my work for 1 year, and I had to think about it, what is going on. Yeah, at the end, I think I found a way to analyze. I mentioned Cynthia, but I have to also mention Nira Yuval Davis and also Floya Antias. And it became possible to analyze the situation also when you are an insider. But I want to say also this, I was an insider, but being the one who asked questions it puts you a bit also outside of the field.
Yes.
You know, you have to always manage to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. Before I shift to ask Cynthia about her reflections, I'd like to actually ask Isa if she would answer Handan's question in terms of how, you know, the interviews, the research affected you. Are you the same Isa who started the research?
No, definitely not. I don't think you can be, because if you've grown up in the Swiss hills like I have, you have no idea what violence is like, what it feels like, what it does to people, what it does to communities. And you can read all you want about doing ethnographies in a war zone. You can read all you want about previous struggles and the gender dynamics thereof, but being in it and affected by it and being so close to people who are giving their lives for it, I think that really changes you profoundly. And I mentioned this feeling of inadequacy, and that was really something that I still have today. You know, I wrote this book and other people are giving their lives and are in prison or have died. It's just this, it's a dilemma that I couldn't resolve. Yeah, I had always tremendous respect for everyone I interviewed. With some people I had a better rapport than with others. With some people I felt like I can go beyond what I call these slogans. With others I couldn't, and that's also totally fine. And I think what helped me also, so yes, on one hand I became radicalized and militarized myself, but I also started seeing more and more these patriarchal controls that you just mentioned, Handan, and also the violence. Violence is perhaps a bit strong, but the coercion that goes into making these militants that are then able to go and fight and be deployed and to a certain extent controlled. And what I try to do in my work is to show how it's both, right? How it's both coercive, but also liberating and emancipatory. What really helped me towards the end of my research to find, hopefully, that balance was also to conduct quite a number of interviews with people who had left the party, who were able to speak to me more frankly, more openly, not to say that they were telling me an entirely different story, but they were not bound to let's say, an official script. And I think that then really sort of hopefully created that balance where I'm also quite critical or asking more questions into the direction of the price that the women pay, of hopefully these, and I'm able to hopefully show these complexities that go into the becoming of the freedom fighter or of the politician.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. So Cynthia, I'm now would love to hear from you in terms of your reflections on positionality ethics. I mean, you have been studying both the militarization of everyday lives, but also, you know, the participation of women in national liberation wars globally. So I assume that you have grappled with these issues, and can you share some of your reflections?
Well, I think grappled is the word.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, grappling not just as an analyst or an observer or a person in pursuit of understanding, whatever that means, right? But also what Isabel reminds us is that every one of these women is grappling, right? And Isabel, you use the word balance, but your book is full of the unsteadiness of balance. You know, if it's balance, it's standing on one foot in a stiff wind, you know, on the edge of a cliff oftentimes. And one of the things that I think is so valuable about the way you've worked this out is if you've brought us, your readers, into your resistance to pursue resolution intellectual and political resolution. One of the things that is so terrific, and for all of you who are out there listening, remember, this is a book to read, not just a conversation to listen to, right? Go read the book, because one of the strengths, I think, Isabel, is that you refuse to pursue resolution, the resolution of should women join armed struggle, right? That big question, which is a question all the time, everywhere. I mean, that's North Africa, that is Vietnam, that is now Ukraine. Should women, do they lose everything? Do they gain something, but they don't gain enough? What your exploration reminds us is, don't always think you have to resolve everything, because in fact, it is very unsteady. And you have to, and this, your caveat is such a good one at the end. You say, keep paying attention. This isn't over. And how long are we going to have to watch? Right? And what are we going to have to watch 20 years from now, 30 years from now? I mean, one of the best books on women who fought in the armed struggle in the Castro-led revolution in Cuba is that it has just come out, and she has interviewed women who are still alive, you know, years, decades later, for them to think about, well, what did they gain? What did they lose? What were they surprised at? What, you know, what was worth it? And my guess is, I'm hoping that, you know, in 20 years, you will actually track down a number of these women, if they're still alive, and ask all these questions again. So let me, if I can, Nadia, if I can switch here a little bit and ask Isabel to talk to us all about why one of the themes that I don't think you started out thinking would be so central, but it strikes me that it is central to your whole exploration and what you now think you have done and what you'd like to go back and pursue, and that is desexualization. And why the party, particularly the male leadership, why the party insisted on, why the women internalized the desexualization necessity, what is its long-term consequences for individual women? It won't all be the same. Why does desexualization become so crucial to your whole exploration and your ongoing, I mean, because you're still the curious feminist, and I know you're still thinking about these things. Why did desexualization become so central to your journey?
It's a good question, because it wasn't in the beginning.
No, I didn't.
It was something that I was aware of and that I knew was part and central part of the ideology and its practices. But as I was going through these different field sites, I was not only struck by how uniform the things that were being told to me, but also how uniform the people were behaving in their bodies, how they were sitting, how they were talking, walking, eating, smoking. That militant personality was really something quite striking to me. As I then went to the mountain camps, that's where I learned how that is practiced and taught and embodied but also policed. So it's not just, I think, well, I hope that I described the desexualization as part of the larger part of the becoming of the fighter and how that is taught and learned. I describe the auto-control, so the self-control that people learn in the party, and I describe irade, so the will to resist, the will to go on and fight and make the struggle bigger. And the desexualization happens there. It happens when people decide to sacrifice everything for this struggle. And to me, I guess that's one of the main conundrums, the main tensions that you rightly say I do not resolve, is this nexus between armed struggle, national liberation that promises women's liberation and has at its core that women's liberation, and the desexualization. because yes, the movement promises women's liberation, and it really gives the women tremendous agency and new spaces to organize and express themselves, politicize around. But it happens at the cost of this desexualization. And I found that I spoke to many people, and most of them, for most of them, that was a price that they were willing to pay, because it meant that they could participate in this larger struggle for the liberation of Kurdistan and women more broadly. And then there were others who also, of course, felt that that is a high price to pay. Others said again that you would forget about it after a while. Then I spoke to people who had left the party who said, you know, it's just, it goes after a while, you become cold. I described this in my conclusion, I think. It's a sense of becoming cold. I then also looked at how this desexualization is policed and the norms that go around it. And I describe it as part of my concept of militant femininity. And there you see that it's actually policed quite harshly. People who don't abide by these rules of no romance and no sexual relationships, they have to go back to education, they have to go back to prison. And yes, I found that extremely interesting. So how far does the liberation go, and where and how strict is the framework around these militant femininities?
Yeah. Cynthia, did you want to come back? You're muted.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me is that there are very few, except for very consciously feminist interrogations with ethnographic field research, definitely with ethnographic field research, not from afar, not long after, but during, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in the Huk Rebellion, HUK, the Huk Rebellion in the Philippines, in Colombia, every single insurgent movement that has deliberately, at least the leadership, and usually male leadership, recruited women, and usually young women, right? So we're not just talking about women in their 60s, or not just, we're talking about women, some from 15 years old girls, 15 years old to say 32 years old. I mean, that's a very particular time in what the sexual life of any woman or girl, and in any boy or man. And that in every one of those movements, there has been leadership efforts to strategize around marriage, to strategize around sexual liaisons, to police women differently than men, girls differently than 30-year-old women, and that oftentimes is not the basis of comparison between insurgencies that have a sizable number of women in it. And I think you're putting it front and center conceptually, meaning that you really consistently asked these questions and pursued them, even if they weren't neat answers, is really so valuable. And you could almost take your book and relook at what we know about the Guatemalan insurgency, or what we know about the Colombian still unfolding insurgency, and ask precisely that question, rather than treating it as if it is trivial, or it is not, as if male leaders, particularly male leaders, and some of the women just at the top, as if they don't think about it a lot.
Yeah, well, so my follow-up question was along the lines in terms of the conundrums that you're facing, because I know, and we've also experienced that, Isa, writing together. One of the conundrums is to write about something, like the desexualization and the way that gender and sexuality are controlled, in a context where, of course, then there is the accusation that is, quite prevalent, and it's to be expected that is a Western, Western approach. It's a Western obsession with sexuality, and sexuality is being fetishized. And that is, of course, the way that, that critique is being discredited. And so I know that it's a conundrum to talk about this. And I was just wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that and other potential conundrums you were facing, both academically and politically.
Yes. So, as I said, I think my work tries to address, or this is at the heart of my work, this conundrum of armed struggle, which leads to militarization, and we know militarization leads not to more gender equality. Women as a key pillar to a non-state nationalism. As we know, nationalisms lead to the essentialization of new gender norms and relations in this new or free, as we know, new or free women, and this process of desexualization, or the abstinence contract, as I call it. And I thought about this a lot, and traced these linkages between the body politics and the liberation ideology. And because eventually, Cynthia, and this also answers a bit more your previous question, I think that this abstinent contract is actually an integral part of gaining access to a movement that is then able to fight for a new version of society, but also a key location through which the movement controls its members. And I show how this ideology creates a new body politics, but that creates new spaces for agency, but also new modes of control. And as you rightly say, Nadia, it's really not easy to write about this, and it's without not only to then be accused of being obsessed with sexuality or with the Western view on it, but also to not reproduce Orientalist tropes of the oppressed women in the Middle East. And I hope I succeeded to not do that by putting my explorations into a conversation with the literature that emerged after the so-called Arab Spring and later Gezi, that analyzes the way in which revolutions are deeply embodied affairs, and that in moments of rupture and political upheaval, all the new powers at play always use women's bodies as battlegrounds and as markers of the new us versus them. And I show that wherever the party holds power, women become the markers of freedom. So they demarcate the boundaries between us, the gender equal society based on radical democracy, and them, the barbaric other, Daesh, Turkish and Syrian regimes, for example. But women are clearly not just the markers, but also the makers. This sounds a bit pathetic, but I do end one of my chapters like this, because it is really them who are doing the political, activist, and often military work. One former party member that I interviewed and who had spent 24 years in the party told me that without the women, the movement would have actually been long dead, that it's really them who are the backbone, because it's the women who are pushing this party forward, the women who are pushing for women's liberation and national liberation at the same time. So yeah, as Cynthia rightly says, I cannot resolve these tensions, and instead I try to show how with the Kurdish movement it's much more it's never a clear-cut either or case, but very much a both and. I found that the movement complicates and confirms and reinvents and reproduces theories and tropes on war, gender, sexuality, and nationalism. And one way that these complexities, but also tensions, became readable or graspable for me was through that concept that I crafted and called militant femininities, which describes both what it means to become a militant in this movement and on how one obtains that identity, but also how practices and ideas around womanhood have shifted and are embodied by my respondents. And just perhaps finally, on a political challenge or tension, is for me the question of how do we practice what we call critical solidarity, to be in solidarity with this movement, and of course Kurdish self-determination, while also asking more critical questions, to be that skeptically curious military analyst that Cynthia writes about. And that's a question that I have not answered for myself, but I try to navigate its pitfalls by always going back to the feminist literature, in which those of us, not those of us, those who came before us have already given us some of the tools. And I try to be in continuous conversation with the many friends and colleagues that I've made along the way, both within the movement, on its fringes, but also those who have left, and to kind of constantly check back my ideas and my concerns and my questions.
Thank you. Before moving to the audience questions and comments, I was wondering, Handan, if you had some thoughts on this, because those issues must have also, I assume you were facing some conundrums, and maybe you have some thoughts, particularly on this idea of control of sexuality. And would you like to say a few words about that?
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you for giving this opportunity to me. Actually, I think the main point here is that this control is not just imposed on women. They obey willingly, most of them at least, and they embrace the new identity of woman, or free woman, or goddesses. It is not imposed to them, and I think it is important to think about why women accept this, why they embrace an identity which has also control mechanisms. I think, what can I say on this? I think the answer of why they accept is lies in the conditions they live in the utopia they believe in, or in daily life experiences and dynamics of their struggle. They embrace this new identity, or being sexualized, because it opens the doors of social and political involvement to them. It is very important. As a last point, maybe I can tell this. Actually, Isabel also highlighted this point at her book. This new identity, or desexualized women or goddesses, I think it is a strategic tool for women to fight against the male dominance and gender inequalities in the movements, and also in the society too. So it is like a bargaining, patriarchal bargaining of women, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Handan. So I'm moving to the audience questions. So there's just one comment by Julia Wadman, who says that she thinks your book is fantastic and has inspired her tremendously. So thank you, Isabel, for that. Question by Petek Onur, saying, sorry, I missed the first 10 minutes of the session. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I'd like to know Isabel Käser's conclusion about whether it is possible to talk about a Kurdish feminist movement which raises a different or critical voice against the Kurdish movement and or PKK, or is Kurdish feminism an integral, in brackets, uncritical part of the Kurdish movement?
What a question. Handan, do you want to answer it?
I'm sorry, I missed it. Could you repeat?
Do I understand correctly? Is the question, can there be a Kurdish feminism outside of the PKK's Kurdish women's movement? That's the question, right?
Yeah, or at least, that, I mean, so is there Kurdish feminism, has that to be integral and, in brackets, uncritical part of the Kurdish women's movement, or can it be posing a critical voice to the Kurdish movement, political movement?
Oh, okay. Well, Handan, you will second me, right? Or do you want to go? Okay,
no, please go.
So if I understand the trajectory of the Kurdish women's movement correctly, it has always been in competition with, or competition in friction and conversation with the movement as a whole. I write a whole chapter about how women were fighting for their space within the movement, and how their male comrades were sabotaging them along the way, and so on. And I think the ideology as a whole has actually grown because women were continuously pushing for more representation and more political spaces. How much space for criticality is within those spaces is something that is still a mystery to me. I know women can continuously develop. I know they can challenge their male comrades, but how far can they challenge the official ideology? I have my remaining question marks. Handan, do you want to come in here?
First, I would like to state that actually there were feminist Kurdish women groups who were critical, both Kurdish women and for Turkish feminism in 1990s. Mm-hmm. And there were feminist Kurdish journals also, like Rosa Jujin. They were distant from Turkish feminists and also Kurdish women. For them, Kurdish women were gender blind, and Turkish feminists were also blind to Kurdish women. So when it comes to the question, I think there is a very unique relationship between Kurdish women's movement and Kurdish women movement, because when we consider this woman movement related to Kurdish movement, it occurred from Kurdish women movement, and the beginning point for Kurdish women was being a Kurd. But in the struggle through the experiences, and also thanks to the ideology, gender equality ideology of the movement, they developed. Yeah, of course, they do not define it as feminist, but I think it was a kind of feminist consciousness and also feminist solidarity, especially at the end of 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, because at that time, very big numbers of women, they came together on the mountains and also in the cities under the political parties. And maybe the first what was important for them firstly was being a Kurd, but in the practice they developed a feminist consciousness, but not completely independent feminist movement occurred, because it is very closely related again to Kurdish movement. When there is not a tension between agenda of the Kurdish women's movement and Kurdish movement, and also when there is not an armed conflict, it is easy to go together. But when the war starts again, and when how can I define it? Yeah, priorities actually. For example, in the March, there is 8th March, Women's Day, and then Nevroz. We were always told that, however, please be careful so that we do not risk the Nevroz celebrations. This is the tension that I can say.
Yeah, I have to say that when I did research when I was in Diyarbakir and talked to Kurdish women activists, I was so struck by, if, for instance, in the context of the Palestinian women's struggle, it's very clear, there is always this pressure to stress the occupation as the primary source of violence, including gender-based violence. Although I should say that the new generation of feminists is also challenging that. But so I was really, really surprised when Kurdish women activists would tell me, yes, of course, we have problems with the Turkish state, but 2 articles in the constitution could change our relationship with the Turkish state. but the struggle that we have with our Kurdish brothers is so much harder. And
I think told this to you.
Yes, I like it, exactly. And I was so surprised, but I could also imagine that given the way that the political situation has shifted and that the Kurdish political movement has come under such tremendous attack in Turkey, that those kind of positions might shift. I mean, as you say, Handan, I think that the kind of context they might affect the emphasis. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to encourage the audience to put questions. There's one question that I don't think we can answer because it deals with Armenian, the first all-woman military unit that was created. I don't know. So the question is, Turkish and Russian troops will guard the Armenian Artsakh border for the next 5 years, though this was not the end to the ongoing conflict with Azerbaijan that either Armenia or Artsakh wanted. A historic glass ceiling was broken for the women of Armenia. So because the first all-woman military unit was created. And the question is, how does this female unit compare to the Kurdish female fighters featured in your book? I don't expect you, Isabel or Handan, to have an answer. I don't know anyone, Cynthia. Anyone knows anything? Cynthia, would you like?
No, I would just do a pause here. There are a number of states, and this is all since the passage written by feminists, but the passage in the UN Security Council of what is called the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. That's its full title, 1325. That since then, a number of still patriarchal states, even if there's contest, has shrunk down their notion of fulfilling 1325 by bringing more women into their state militaries. It's kind of the easy, lazy, statist way to just take the superficial reading of women need to be civil society women, women with authentic representation. This is what 1325 calls for, need to be part of the crafting of any kind of ceasefire or end of wars and peace building. That's what 1325 is supposed to be. A lot of governments, and not just the Armenian, have shrunken that requirement since October 2000, that requirement that all UN state members actually try to fulfill 1325. They've shrunken it down to adding more women to militarized peace units or to units of the state military and then deploy them in the name of peace. And a lot of feminists all over the world who work so hard to get 1325 passed say that is not what the intention was. I'm so interested to hear this, Nadia, from your participant. I'm so interested to hear what the Armenian state and the Armenian Ministry of Defense think they're doing, and what the women, of course, in this new unit positioned on the conflict border, what they think they are doing. It could be very essentialist.
Yes.
That is, that women keep the peace just because they're women. Whereas if they're part of a state military, they are also militarized women.
Yes.
And so I will be very interested to hear that. We need to hear more from Armenian feminists.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that, Cynthia. A comment by Neslihan Yaklav. I think it is really important to talk about the PJKK for women's struggle and feminism during the struggle. This structure gave a space to women in the PKK. Handan, would you like to come in here? PJKK?
I can, or Handan can.
Please, Isabel.
Okay.
Or you can go first, and I can go after, as you want. Hi, Neslihan. So the PJKK was the first formal women's party within the PKK, and it was something that the women had been fighting for since the early 90s. And they had their first military units after 93, 95, and then in 99, they decided at that Congress that they also wanted to have their own party within the party. And at that time, Öcalan was arrested, and so the whole party was in upheaval, and the women who had pushed for this separate party within the party were all arrested by their male comrades and put in a valley for a long time. Some women told me they were there for 3 months. Someone I recently spoke to, they said they were there for a year. So they were basically imprisoned by their male comrades who said, now is not the time to sabotage the party. Now is not a time to divide the party. Now is the time to be united, because we're being attacked, and we must have a united front. In my history chapter, there's a whole sub-chapter around this history of the PJKK. And why I think Neslihan brings it up, it's because there have always been more militant groups within the PKK. So, or let's say different groups of women, some closer to the men and who we call the big brothers, and some much more driven to really achieve independence for women within the PKK. But the women who pushed PJKK were all quite severely punished, not only by being kept in that valley, but then over the years to come, to be kept from important positions. Many of them left the party as well.
Handan, did you want to add anything? Or
actually, I read the details of this situation from Isabel's book. Actually, I knew about it. It was again related to the tension we talked about, or the agenda of free women movement and agenda and structure of the movement. Actually, the tension was very high after imprisonment of Öcalan, and women, they wanted to keep being independent, and it wasn't accepted. And details Isabel already told. The same tension, actually. It isn't a completely, totally independent movement.
Okay, I suggest that I'm going to read out the next 2 questions because I'm conscious of time, and then we can see how much time we have for answering. So questions by 2 friends, colleagues, one by Vera Ikarios Kelly. Hi, Vera. She says, brilliant panel, and what a great contribution your book, Isabel, is to the existing literature. Do you have any comments on diasporic support for what you define as militant feminism? And then the other question by Elif Genç. Hello, Elif. This has been a fascinating talk, and I'm looking forward to reading Isabel's book. I've only read yours and Nadia's work on genealogy and education in the mountains. The conundrum that you speak of between insider-outsider, I believe Handan touched on it, which speaks to a larger decolonizing methodology where there is a practical responsibility to the Kurdish women's involvement you're involved with. Do you find you're expected to a certain extent to contribute to the larger struggle on the ground separate from academia, and also to be responsible when we're conducting research as Kurdish studies scholars to not further harm the movement given its precarity regarding illegality? Were you ever in spaces where you were not just a researcher, but just a participant, being privy to things that an academic never would be necessarily? Okay, Isabel.
Good question. Thanks, Elif. Okay, where to start, Vera or Elif? Vera, I have to be honest that I have not really worked on diaspora activism. So my book does not touch on it, and I think that's a whole other area of expertise that I think you hold. but of course, I mean, we're talking here about a huge transnational movement that is so based and so dependent on diaspora support, financial, political, activist, and all the networks it creates amongst academics and activists here and in Latin America, North America. I believe perhaps the most interesting location to observe that is what is happening with genealogy, how it's being developed, the workshops that are happening, and the publications that are coming out of that. But other than that, I don't know so much about diaspora support. Elif, I don't think I've been in places that others have not been privy to. I believe, or so I hear, that the movement has always been very welcoming to journalists, feminists, academics in times of relative stability. We cannot call it peace, but many people have had access to the spaces that I've had access to. I know I'm very fortunate to have been there, but I don't think I've seen anything that they didn't want to show me or that others haven't seen, I would say. She also asked what was the other part, whether I'm expected to support. Now you're muted.
Sorry, in terms of the practical responsibility, do you find that are you expected to a certain extent to contribute to the larger struggle on the ground, separate from academia?
Yes. Yes and no. When I was in the Peshak structures in the mountains, so the part of the PKK that's fighting in Iran, and they made it quite clear, we're now also giving you the pervade, the education. So I went to a week of education so that I could then support them in Europe and help to spread the word and do some organizing work for them there. I said, maybe let's talk about it, and it then didn't materialize. Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Oh no, maybe I should add one thing, but that's of course then a huge conundrum and a huge question that we continue to ask ourselves with being academics who also sometimes call ourselves activists. What is the depth? What is expected of us? What can we participate? How can we help is a stupid term, but how can we continue to be involved, and how can we show that solidarity? And I think there are different ways that we all explore, some more successful than others.
Yeah, it's I mean, I've been grappling with the same tensions and questions, and I think there is also very much the question of, you know, who your audience is, and so, you know, in context where so I've actually found there was a big shift moving from SOAS to Brown in all my years being at SOAS, so that's the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. You know, we had lots of events at the Center for Gender Studies, jointly organized with Kurdish women's movements in London, and you know, hardly had any issues in terms of audience. But here I organized a teach-in following the Turkish invasion of Rojava, and I had lots of issues, you know, with Turkish nationalists. So I mean, it's also, you know, what you feel comfortable saying in which context, you know, what are sort of safer spaces. And yes, I mean, I personally find that Kurdish studies context is not a very safe space to articulate criticism, but that's my personal opinion. I was wondering, Handan, would you like to come in here as well?
I just want to add information about diaspora activism of Kurdish women, which posed to Isabel. Actually, at the moment, there is an ongoing field research on it by Münevver Azizoğlu Bazan. I don't know if she is also here. Maybe she's here. She's an academic and also an activist of Kurdish women's movement, and she is doing her PhD thesis on diaspora activism. Just I wanted to add this information, and
Thank
she
you.
has already written some articles on it.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. So, of course, we could continue this conversation for a long time, but I would like to take the opportunity to thank you both. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, all three of you, but particularly joining us as guests, Cynthia and Handan, and of course, Isabel. I'm so proud of you, and your work is really amazing. And the book, I very strongly encourage everyone who hasn't read the book, to look at it. Yes, thank you, Cynthia. And I would also like to thank the audience for your questions and your attendance. We will make the event available, the recording of the event, so you can share it with friends and colleagues. And so, yes, thank you. And goodbye, everyone.
Well done, Isabel.
Yeah, well
Thank you.
done.